Okay, we're at the point in this video series where I think it's probably necessary for me to show you something about the materials inside of ZBrush. We've already kind of looked at using the default Skin Shade 4 material and how that's a pretty good material to use whenever we're just painting these color maps. But after you have the color map painted, it might be good for you to change the material so you can kind of get an idea of maybe what this thing is going to look like whenever you want it to render as a particular thing. If you want it to look more metallic or glass-like or skin, you're going to have to choose a different material. And if we're going to render inside of ZBrush, we can assign these shaders inside of ZBrush. But maybe you want to get some kind of an approximation of what this is going to look like when you render this in some other package, like say Maya, 3D Studio Max, or something like that. So ZBrush has given us this cool opportunity to create different material types within ZBrush and then also assign them to your different objects. So the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is if we have an object selected, I'm just going to go ahead and hit this solo button just so we can kind of focus in on this thing that we're looking at. If we are using texture maps, I'm going to pull this down. We're in Tool. I'll drag this down and open up the texture map area. You'll see that there's a fill area in here, and if you have a texture map on, this is going to be a little bit different than if you don't have a texture map on. So let me turn this off real quick. Okay, so right now, if I switch to some other material type, it should give me an updated preview of what the object's going to look like with that material on. And this is me just, if I've got Polypaint on, like this, right? So it is possible to fill this material into the object itself when we're using the poly painting. So let's choose like this matte cap metal 3. We'll put it on that, and then if I want to fill this object with a material, I can just make sure this M is turned on, and that stands for material. This is RGB, and this is material with RGB, so you'll get the color there. Once I have this turned on and I have the RGB intensity up to 100, I can go to Color and say Fill Object. And now it's going to fill this object with that material. So if I switch to some other material, it's going to stay the same here, like that, right? Here's something interesting that you can do. You can go ahead and turn off this Z add. And if I have material turned on, I can actually just paint that material directly onto the model. So we can get different material types on one object, and that's how you would do it. You can go ahead and paint these things out if you wanted. There's not a smooth transition between these things in the preview, but if you do the best possible render, I do believe it blends between these different materials that you have. So I'll go back and let's just do something obvious. We'll fill it with this reflected map material. So we'll go to Color, say Fill Object. So right now, obviously, if I switch to a different material, since we filled this, it doesn't switch the materials for us like we might want. So if we want to get that functionality back, we can go to the materials and we can go to Flat Color and go ahead and select that. And then we'll go Color and say Fill Object. Okay, now once we do that, we see the object with just flat color, so you're just seeing purely the shading that's coming from the poly painting or the texture information. So at that point, after I've filled it with this material, I can go ahead and go back to that mode of where we're changing the different materials just by selecting these and changing them over here in the slot. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now things work a little bit differently whenever we have a texture on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn texture on, and then let me try to change these different materials, and you can see I've actually got this thing filled with a material, and it's filled in a special way with the texture. So right now I can't get this thing to change materials on the fly. Now if you have the texture map on, it's got this special area for filling with materials and colors, or fill with gradients in here. So you open up this fill, and we can go down to the flat color and say Fill Material. And once we fill it with that material, we get that functionality back where we can change materials at will just by selecting them within this trough and through here. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that I want to show you is how we can start to build our own custom materials beyond maybe what these defaults show. Okay, so I'm going to select this reflect map material. So I'll go ahead and select that. Sorry, let's go ahead and select that. And then with this fill within here in the texture map area, just go ahead and say fill material. So I'll click that, and then now you can see I can't change to some other material. This is actually embedded into the model at this point. So I'll just put it back on that material. So now we can take a look at some of the settings for this material. Okay, so I'm going to go to material up here, and I'm going to go ahead and dock this so it pushes it off to the right. And if we drag this down, we can see under modifiers, we've got different settings for this material that we've got. And there's also in the mixer area, there's different things that we can kind of play with to change the material type on here as well. And you might look at this environment thing. I'm not really messing around with that too much. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this modifier. And let's talk real quick about these different slots. So this material is obviously has got a nice reflection going on it, so it's reflecting some kind of image that you could probably tell is going on behind here. But if we go to this S1, that's slot 1, you can see this is the texture map that it's actually reflecting. And we've got this add reflection and sub reflection that's on here, so you can play with these sliders. And a lot of times you might see this curve, maybe it's a reflective curve or specular curve, diffuse. You can click on this curve and you can see that you can take the points that are in the curve and you can kind of start playing with these things. So maybe for this I want it to be more reflective on the outer part but not as much on the inner part. You can see I'm kind of building this curve to where this is the reflective value for the outside and it dips down towards the inside. And if we want, we can click and we can add a new curve point on here. You can click and drag these circles to make that point sharper or not as sharp. If you want to get rid of it, you just click and drag it outside of there and it gets rid of it altogether. So at this point I'm working with just two curves. I could push it all the way up and it makes the whole entire thing 100% reflective all the way through the object. If you take this first point and drop it down, I think you can see kind of what's going on here now at this point. It's less reflective as the surface moves away from the camera. And if we really want to kind of accentuate that, we can put a point here in the middle and drag that out. So let me get rid of that real quick. So I can click and drag and hold down Alt as well. So this is how we can make a really sharp cornered point. So we click and drag to give us this point here, and if we move this thing outside of here like what we've done before, I'm still holding down, and if I add the Alt modifier while I'm outside of this and then bring it back in, it produces a super sharp curve point for us. So that might come in handy for you if you're trying to build these really super sharp points at any given time. So I could click this again here and here, and you can see the kind of look that that's giving for that. So yeah, this produces some kind of interesting effects. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of these curves real quick so we can kind of really see what's going on here. So if you want to close up the curve, click this little close guy, and that's going to close this up here. So here's where you could actually change out this texture that's being used for the reflectivity of this. I can actually click on that image and then I could say import, and then I could navigate to some place where I've got texture sitting. So let me just go in the C drive. I've got some texture sitting around environment. You can see some of these different textures that I've got that I've kind of made, and some of them I've found on the internet. It's pretty easy to find some different reflection maps out there. But if you can't find some, you could just make this in Photoshop and make it kind of tile into itself. It's not even necessary that it actually has to tile, but you can really change the look of whatever this material is based off of this image file that you're going to import in. So I'll choose this one here, and that'll give a different look. Choose this. You can see it's producing quite a different look at that point. Here's something that I shot that was a texture. Well, it was actually a photograph of it's a fisherman's wharf, and that was actually in San Francisco when I got to go visit that. And basically, it just took the whole thing and kind of blurred it out. So you can't really see any kind of details, but it does pick up the color information from that. Okay, so you can see what this is producing now with that map. Then I also took that map and then went into Photoshop and then did some color adjustments to where I changed the color of the sky and the color of the ground and things like that. So then this one's got more like of a green color towards the bottom and then red towards the top. And you can see another variation of that. It's got a little more browns towards the bottom. So depending on kind of what that look is that you're going for, just changing the map that you're using for the reflection can have a pretty drastic effect on things. So I'm going to go ahead and hit import. I think I'm going to use, I will use this this map here like this. Okay, so this is what is in the slot 1 for this material. So you're going to kind of have to investigate these different materials that ZBrush has provided for you and kind of start looking at these different slots that they have open and kind of breaking down maybe how the material works and how you can kind of change it to meet the needs that you're looking for. So one thing you can do is these little open circles here. If you click on this, that's actually basically hiding whatever that slot is. So you can see I've hid slot 1 and slot 2, and now my model is completely black because there's no material information. If I turn this first slot on, it actually is still going to be black because this reflective part is actually being used in slot 2 over here. Okay, so let me turn this back on. So you can see here is a difference with slot 2 when I turn on the reflectivity of this channel or turn it off. So I'll leave that on and take a look at this channel. Actually, I'm gonna turn this off just so we can see this channel all by itself. So right now with this this channel, this is kind of the look that we're getting here with the specular highlights and the amount of ambient and diffuse. So let's take a look at ambient, and we'll take diffuse down. We'll make the diffuse curve just full on diffuse. Okay, so right now everything's black. I'm going to take the specularity, I'll drop that down to 0, so everything turns to black at that point. If I take up the ambient, you can see how when I start cranking that up, it's as if there's even distributed light that's just kind of coming on all around the object. So that's what's going to give you ambient. You want to be a little bit careful with over cranking that because you can kind of lose a lot of your shading if the ambient is too high. You can see it at 100%. There's really not any shading going on. You're just getting pure color at that point. And something interesting to note about that is this is basically kind of simulating the material type, this flat color. That's basically what flat color is going to do for you. It's basically going to give you, there's no diffuse or anything else like that. All the colors coming from either the texture or the Polypaint or the color of the object, and that's with it's basically got the ambient cranked 100% for that at that point. So with this ambient, we can drag that down. We can get something to where it looks like there's a little bit of light all the way around this thing. The next thing we can do is start playing with the diffuse. So let me close that curve and open it up for you again. So again, I've just got a point on the left and the right, and I'm going to drag that all the way to the top, so it's basically giving me 100% value all the way across the entire object at that point. So if I start dragging diffuse up, I'll put this at around, I think, 80. I know from my time working in Maya, it seems like a lot of their materials, I think their diffuse is set at around 80 or so for the diffuse on that. So you can see if I take ambient all the way down, We've got this diffuse, but we're still getting, some nice kind of shading around the object, so we're getting a sense of what the volume's about. We're still able to see the fake shadows inside of ZBrush under here and stuff like that, so that helps as well. But if we drag the diffuse all the way up, it's going to kind of overdrive these values just a little bit and make everything kind of more evenly lit. So I'll drop that back down to 80. And then with the ambient, then I can start just cranking that up a little bit to kind of get it the value where I want. Maybe add a little bit, just 10 to that. Okay, so with specularity, we've got the same thing with specularity where we've got, if we just take these points and drag the left and the right, we're going to put 100% on that, right? So that's the specular curve. If we take the specular value and start dragging that up, we can start seeing this quite a bit. So obviously, with this specular curve turned all the way up 100%, all the way across the thing, we're getting this even wash of lighter value going all the way across the object. So if we put this at 100%, it's going to really kind of blow this thing out. So let's just leave it at 100% for now and kind of play with these curve points and just see what that looks like if we start to alter those. Okay, so if we drag this point down, it's going to focus the highlight facing the camera more. And we could add another point and drag that thing down and start making that point even tighter. I have noticed with ZBrush, if I want to make a really super tight highlight, I got to take this point and drag it really close to the edge here like this. And at that point, this is giving you a nice super tight highlight for something like glass or a reflected surface, or it can give the illusion that maybe the surface is kind of wet. So again, we'll just pull this point up a little bit, get a nice kind of specularity going throughout the whole thing. So now I can take the specular value and I can drag it down and kind of slowly introduce that specularity till I get it to the point where I'm kind of happy with this. Right around in there. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. With this part, I was noticing it was kind of, if I turn up this, not even sure how to say what they've written here, but Metallicy. If we drag this thing up, it kind of has the opposite effect of what I was kind of hoping for. I was kind of hoping that this might make it look a little more metallic. So if I drag that all the way down to 0, you might want to put it on that value. You might want to crank that up just a little bit to knock back some of the specularity that we just made within there. Noise is kind of interesting. You could add noise directly into the look of this thing. Instead of doing it maybe at render time, you might want to have just a slight bit of noise added to your surface, just to kind of break up, the smoothness factor on it. So that's possible as well. So there's a lot of other sliders and things that you can kind of play with, and not every slider kind of works for each shader. It's kind of what I'm getting out of this is that they've made like this Uber shader kind of thing, and only certain slots work depending on what type of material that you're using. So let's look real quick at this specular color that we got. So right now it's just kind of like a white highlight. We can go down here, you can see there's these different slots that we can click for spec or diffuse, ambient, cavity. So we can actually change this, make it into a color. So let's say we choose a lighter kind of blue color like this. You're not going to actually see any kind of change until you introduce some of the color within the colorized specular, and it's set to 0 right now. So if we drag this slider up, we can start to affect the color of that specularity. So I've got it 100% now. Now the color of this spec will actually be completely driven by what colors I'm choosing with inside of here. So we could do an orange color, you know, push it towards red, something like that. You can go green, whatever color you want to use. You know, depending if you want to cool this thing down or if you want to warm it up, you know, you can choose cool colors, warm colors. You might have to readjust some of your specular values if you introduce this color to this. So you can see, like, once I started making this a little more blue, it kind of took the overall spec values and just kind of felt like it lost a little something. So at that point I can take the specular value and I can start cranking that up a little bit more at that point. So you know, as you introduce new things, new techniques, you might have to readjust this a little bit and maybe keep playing with the color stuff. Let's see what I'm interested in what happens when we push this towards red. So if we've got a kind of a value and a range set for here, we can take this slider and move it around the outer corner, and then we can just try different colors at that point and see what might work, what might not. So let's see if we do like purples. It's getting a little too crazy at that point. So if I do red, maybe that's a little too much. Okay, I'll just go with something like that, around in that area. And so let's see here as well. We could try something with the ambient color as well, or we could choose a color for that. And I believe we're going to have to do colorize ambient and put that up. So you can really see the effect of that once we start to crank that up. So again, this is where you'd have to readjust these values, and I could introduce like an overall just red color to the object, or if I wanted with the ambient, this would simulate like you know, we're changing the color of the ambient light in the world, and we could change that to some other color if we want. So that's going to have quite an effect. So if I take the ambient and put it up to, we had it at 10 before, but this value just really kind of blows things out whenever this colorize ambient is turned up. So we could take this value and drop this down as well to kind of get more fine tuning for the value that we're looking for at that point. Alright, let's talk a little bit about how we can mix these two shaders together. So I'm going to turn this slot back on, and you can see it's going to be pretty crazy for how this thing is going to just basically overwrite everything we've done kind of on this part of the shader. So we might want to get some kind of blending of the two going here. So I can click on the slot 1, which is the reflection part, and I can go to mixer and open this up. So you can see within here we've got this replace normal. This is basically like kind of like in Photoshop, you've got different blending modes, so you can go and put this on maybe lighten, darken, multiply, average, add. But I'm noticing with this shader, it doesn't quite blend the way that I would expect that it would. We could hop over to this slot and go to the mixer, and then at this point we might get these things to mix together a little bit better. But I'm going to show you how we can put this. We'll put this on normal and go back to this slot here. How we can basically use some of these sliders here to control how this this shader gets mixed with the other one. So if we take Fresnel and drag this up quite a bit to 100, you can see that it's going to take that reflective part, and it's only going to be reflective on the outer part, what they're considering the Fresnel effect of this, which is kind of like this outer portion of the model. And then we've got a Fresnel fall off exponent. So if we drag that down, we can change the overall kind of way that this thing falls off. If we push it up, we can get a just like a really kind of tight light going across here. And we can drag that down, and you can see it's starting to kick up a little bit more of that here. As we drag it down, it's introducing more of that reflectivity. So let's introduce quite a bit. And we're going to go ahead and let's say in any kind of shadow area, you might want to basically occlude that reflection. So you can drag it up by shadow. So it's going to take a look at wherever there's a shadow at, it will try to occlude that as well. And then we can change the exponent on it. So that's going to have a more drastic kind of fall off for that. We could go by AO as well. The one that I really kind of like, which I usually don't even use the shadow portion, I like by cavity. So then at this point we can really crank this up, and you can see you can go this direction with it and really kind of crank up that difference on there. Let's zoom in just a little bit so we can kind of see what's going on. So you can see right now at this point it's kind of more reflective anywhere where there's not cracks, and if I drag this to a negative value we can go the opposite way, which this is I'm kind of liking this effect a little bit more at this point for this. Like that. And I'm going to take this preview opacity and put that at 100%. I'm not 100% sure about this, but it felt to me like sometimes when I'm doing a best possible render, this preview opacity has some kind of effect on the material and how it displays whenever it's rendered. So I want to make sure it is kind of consistent between the two. I might be completely off base on that, but I've just noticed that sometimes that feels like that helps a little bit for that. So let's just do a BPR render real quick of this and just hit that and let it go through the process of rendering this thing out, because you'll get a little bit different look whenever you render things. So here you can see after it's finished rendered, kind of the final quality look that we've got going on here for this. Just real quick, I'm not really going to go into the rendering stuff too much here, but not under render passes, render properties. You can see what I've got turned on here. I do have shadows, wax preview, and ambient occlusion turned on. And then within here, these are the settings that I'm using for the BPR shadows. So if you just take a look at these values and you kind of plug these in, you'll get a similar look shadow wise. And then also for the BPRAO, these are some of the values that I'm using for that. So again, I'm not going to really go into the rendering component. I just wanted to show you these are the values that I'm using in case you want to get kind of a similar look for these. So let's keep looking at some of the options for this. So now that we've got some kind of cool look going on here, we might want to take a look at the first slot that's got the reflection on it, and let's take a look at the add reflection. We can see we could turn that thing all the way down, so we're taking the reflection out. The sub reflection still doesn't have much of an effect on there. The reflective curve, now this is where we could have a pretty big effect on what this thing looks like reflection wise. So what I had was both these points were all the way up at 100%. So if I take one of the points and drag it down, we could get something to where it looks maybe a little more reflective as it goes away from the camera, or we could go the opposite direction with these points, and then maybe it's a little more reflective as it looks at the camera. I'll let you kind of decide what you think looks best, and then you can put a point in there and kind of pull that up, or you could drag the point up to get a different type of fall off. Okay, and you might, if you want to fall off like this, you might have to add a point here like that. Okay, so then I will go ahead and just render that real quick. Okay, and then this is the look that we're getting right now with this shader, and I think it looks pretty cool. The next step I want to show you is how we can basically add a little bit more to this. Let's add another spec pass to this and make a tighter highlight on here. So basically with the material that they've given us, we've maxed out the slots that it has. You can see slot 3 and slot 4 are grayed out. So we're going to have to go find some kind of solution to add another slot to that, and I'm going to show you that. Before I do that, let me see. I think I filled this, so I can't change materials. Okay, so again, to get that interactive material change, let's go ahead and put that on that flat color, and then I'm going to go ahead and go to the my tool and go drag down and find the texture map area, and then open up that fill and say fill material. So then at that point, then I can go ahead and switch out different materials again. So I've got that ability back. So I was working with ZBrush's default reflected map material, and here it sits right there. So this is something I should probably tell you guys about. If you take ZBrush's default materials and you start kind of messing with them and changing them, those changes do stick for the duration of you working on your project. So if I go and say File, Save As, it's going to save the project with all these material changes that I'm making. So that's just something you might want to keep in mind. I believe that ZBrush only gives you so many slots for materials, so it's got a lot of materials that are kind of preloaded. So sometimes if I know if I'm going to bring a new material in, I might actually put it on some material that I just know that I don't use that often. So I really don't use this matte cap red clay very often. So if I put it on that and I go under materials and I say load, and I can load a new material, I'll go ahead and find some materials that I've made, and I'll just click on one of these, this reflected metal warm, and load that up. You can see that that shader that was sitting there is no longer there because it's actually been overwritten by the material that you brought in. So that's something else to kind of keep in mind is you might get rid of some of these materials. If that happens, you can get materials back. If we go material and say load, let's go to the Pixel Logic folder where it sits on your C drive for the install. So you go to your current, whatever your current install is that you have, and I'm currently using 4R4 for this demonstration. If we go with inside of here, you can see that there is Z Materials has got some materials in that area. There's Z Startup, and there's materials here. So if you wanted specific materials of your own to show up every time the program loads, you can throw them in here into this folder and it'll load up with that. I usually stay away from that just because I don't know, I've noticed that sometimes that gives me some issues whenever I'm trying to work with some of the materials and make new materials and things like that. It just is probably more of me not completely understanding how that whole thing is working with how many slots are available and things like that. So let's see, if we go out of startup, we've also have this Z data and go into materials, and then there's matte cap materials. So these are all the matte cap materials for the program. And then if you go to startup and we look here, here's all the default materials that come with the program. So like if you get one of these missing from your project or whatever, you need to get it back, this is where you can kind of find it. So if I want to get back to that original reflected map, I can click that and say open, and you can see I can get that back now at that point. Alright, I know this might seem a little crazy, but basically I wanted to show you this tri-shader and the quad shader. In the scene that I had, I told you how you could kind of replace materials that are within the scene, and I guess I wasn't paying attention to the point where it looks like I lost my tri-shader and I couldn't find that anywhere. So I don't know if this shader actually exists in some kind of default that loads up the program that was outside of the areas that I showed you with the materials. But what we could do if we lose something like that, I just loaded up a new clean version of ZBrush, just shut the program down, then restarted it, and then I got the material area here, and my tri-shader is here, and so is the quad shader. So what I could do is just load this material and say save, and I can go ahead and put this in a area where I know I can save keep this. So I always go wherever my version of ZBrush is sitting under basically program files. Mine's x86. You'll see the different versions. I've made a materials folder for myself, and then I've got materials that I get from the web or whatever. If I find some cool materials online, I put them in here, but I've made my own folder for the materials that I've made. So I could just go in here and then just save this thing directly into my folder for safekeeping. So I could do that with a tri-shader and load up the quad shader, and I will save this out in that same area as well. And then I will basically go back to the file that I had. So I'm going to go File and navigate to where that was sitting and go right here, Polypainting, and then these are the project files that I have. I'll just open that up. Okay, now that my project is loaded, it's going to put the materials back to kind of where I had them. I do have the quad shader, don't have the tri shader. That's the one I wanted to show you. So let's kind of get this file back in working order. I was in our subtool. I've got this statue resurf, and I put it on solo so we could just kind of take a look at just that one alone. And if I change my shader on this, we should be able to change different shaders. I don't use this matte cap red clay very often. I don't know if I've actually ever used it, but so with that selected, I can go to material and I'll say load, and I just saved off that material that I was telling you about, where I've got my own custom folder, and then I'll just do tri-shaders material. Okay, so this is going to give me a material, which this took a while to get to this point, so I'm sorry about that. But basically, I've got this material that's got 3 slots open in it. So let me close down brush, stroke, transform. I do need material, so I'll click that and then dock this off to the side over here. So if we go under modifiers, you can see we've got 3 different slots here. We've already talked about how we can turn off each one of these slots and look at them individually, like that. Okay, so it's kind of looks like it's about basically the same thing on each slot. So what I can do is copy from one shader, the slot from one shader into another. So if we go to this reflected map that I was working on, so you can see here's the shader that I was building, and we go to the slots on this, I can go ahead and say copy shader. So I copied that slot, and I'll go back to that tri-shader, and I'll click on the first slot, and I'll say paste shader. Okay, and let me turn these guys off. And remember, this is going to be drawing black if we fill in that first slot. We have to get that second slot in there before something shows up. So I'm going to go back to reflected map, go to the second slot, copy shader, and then go back to that tri-shader, and then paste into this slot here. Okay. And then I have to turn this slot on because I turned it off. So basically now I have slot 1 open, slot 2 is open, they're both visible, and I've basically got my shader back. But now what I could do is I've got this third slot open, and you can see how that kind of adds that extra specularity to it. So if we click on this third slot and take a look at it, it's kind of the same thing. Remember we looked at the ambient, the diffuse on this. You might want to tone that down to 0. Like, the only thing I really want from this is specularity. So here's where this whole blending and the mixer comes into play. And right now it's on replace normal. We could do things like lighten, maybe screen. We'll open that up that, and now at this point I think this is where this black, you can blend on black button comes into play. So if I've done this right, I should just do nothing but add this specularity pass for me. Okay, because basically if we turn off these and we take a look at exactly what we have, since we've taken the ambient all the way down, diffuse all the way down, everything is completely black except for the specularity that we've got going on. Okay, so that's giving us this here. So when we go to blend this, we put it on the screen, which is just going to take the lights and kind of do like an additive process over the top of whatever is below it color-wise or whatever, but it does do a lightening process. But if we turn on this black here, let's see if this actually tells us what this says. So we hold down Control and click on over the top of this. You can read what it's saying, but it's basically going to exclude all the black information and just give us whatever this this lighter color is, and then blend that way. So we'll turn this these guys back on, and so now I've got the opportunity to kind of really play around with this specular curve, and I could make it even tighter if I wish for that. We can make it more broad, but the thing we're trying to add is just a real nice small highlight on top of everything else. So once I've got that going, the next thing is to just kind of lightly introduce this and get something that looks kind of nice and appealing. Okay, like that. And again, also remember, we can control this to where it doesn't it won't render in any of the cracks. To make this a little more easy for us to kind of see, we could change the curve to where something like this, right? And now we can really see the spec for this channel. And if we really wanted to just look at this channel, we could turn off the other slots, so we could just see exactly what we're getting spec-wise from this slot here. So we can go down to the mixer, and we could do by cavity, and make sure we're doing it the right direction, because we don't want any specularity in the cracks themselves. So we could change this value here, the cavity exponent. Get a little bit different look for that. So I definitely don't want it to go in the cracks, so I'll put it right around there. Another thing we could do is mess with the Fresnel. We could go this way with it to make it only viewable when it's facing the camera, like that. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, now we can start playing with the size of the specular, so we can get that nice and small and nice and tight for that highlight. And this is kind of where we're at with everything added together. Still looks a little hot to me on this new spec that we've introduced, so now I can kind of drop that back. So now we've got an overall color, a little bit of just semi-reflectivity going on in the shader, and then we've also add just a little bit of specularity that's different than this kind of broader specularity. And so let's take a look at what this looks like when we render it. So let's get it in position, hit Shift R, and here's the final look of this shader. And the last part of it is just taking the shader itself and just saving it for safekeeping. So we'll go under Material and say Save, and I'm going to throw it into the area that I put my materials, and we could call this Try Shader Metallic. Nixie, and save that off. And so that's basically how you can kind of create your own shaders. You're going to have to experiment with these different slots and then the different materials that ZBrush does provide for you, and trying to get the look that you're going for. So you're gonna have to treat each material a little bit differently. I would, my suggestion would be to find photo reference and then really kind of study whatever material it is that you're trying to create, and try to break down that material, and then try to use ZBrush and the tools that they've given you to try to recreate that look that you're going for.